Hey everyone, tonight we are going back. We have got a Tuesday morning in a 1950s kitchen where the pantry is stocked with things your grocery store stopped carrying 40 years ago, and you are going to spend the day understanding exactly why each one of them was considered absolutely non-negotiable. We have got the story of Crisco, the vegetable shortening that changed how Americans cooked, baked, and thought about fat itself, a product with a stranger and a more deliberate origin than almost anyone who used it ever knew. We have got an afternoon behind the counter of a mid-century grocery store, where a woman named something like Doris or Vera is responsible for every can, every shelf, every customer who comes in looking for something specific, and every customer who does not quite know what they want but expects her to figure it out anyway. And we have got the quiet, carefully maintained gap between the gleaming pantry of the post-war magazine spread and the actual pantry of the actual American household, which was stranger, more practical, more improvised, and considerably more interesting than any advertisement ever let on. So before you get settled, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy spending time here. And leave me a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is wherever you are. I love seeing that. Now get comfortable, maybe pull a blanket up, and let us go back together. The alarm goes off at 6:15, but you have been awake since just before it, the way you always are because your body has learned the schedule better than the clock has. The bedroom is cool in the way that October mornings in the Midwest are cool, not cold enough to be dramatic about it, but cold enough that the idea of getting out from under the blankets requires a specific kind of resolve that takes a moment to locate. You find it. You always do. You're wearing a cotton nightgown that your mother would recognize, and your hair is pinned from the night before under a thin cotton scarf, because you set it yesterday evening, and you're not about to let all of that effort go to waste before the week has barely started. You put your feet on the floor and reach for your housecoat, which is hanging on the hook beside the door because that is where it lives. It has a place, and everything in this house has a place, because a house where things do not have places is a house where mornings become chaos, and you do not have time for chaos. Not today. Not with the church potluck on Thursday, your mother-in-law arriving Friday afternoon, and the ironing from Monday still sitting in the basket at the bottom of the stairs like a quiet accusation. You go down the hall and into the kitchen, and you turn on the light, and for a moment the room is exactly what it is supposed to be. Clean counter, dish rack empty and turned upside down to dry, the percolator sitting where it always sits, on the second burner from the left, because the first burner runs a little hot and you learned that the hard way back in September of 1952 when you scorched an entire pot of oatmeal and the smell was in the curtains for a week. You fill the percolator with cold water from the tap, measure the coffee from the Red Hills Brothers can on the second shelf and set it to percolate. Then you open the pantry. The pantry is not large. It is a narrow closet beside the refrigerator, about 2 feet deep and 4 feet wide, with 4 shelves running the full height of the wall, and it is organised in a way that has taken years to arrive at, and that you could navigate in the dark without touching a single wrong thing, which you have occasionally had to do when one of the children woke up sick in the middle of the night and needed something warm and you did not want to wake your husband. You know this pantry the way a musician knows a piece they have played 10,000 times, not just where everything is, but what everything is for, and what it means when you are running low on it, and what needs to go on the list for Saturday's shopping trip. The first thing you reach for without looking is the Crisco, the blue and white tin, solid and wide, sitting at the front of the second shelf, because it is what you reach for first most mornings, and there is no point in making yourself stretch. You open it, and the smell comes up immediately, that faintly sweet, clean, neutral smell that means nothing in particular and everything simultaneously, because that smell means breakfast is starting, and morning is really beginning, and the day has been officially declared open. You spoon a measure of it into the cast iron skillet and set the skillet on the back burner to warm while you get the eggs from the icebox. The eggs are sitting on their little ceramic holder on the top shelf the way they always are. 6 remain from the dozen you bought on Saturday. You take out 3 because your husband takes 2, and you take 1 and the children have oatmeal until they are old enough to want eggs, which your eldest is beginning to request with a persistence that suggests his oatmeal days are numbered. You set the eggs on the counter beside the stove and go back to the pantry for the oatmeal, which is in a cardboard cylinder with a round Quaker gentleman on the front, sitting on the third shelf beside the cream of wheat, and the box of wheatina that your husband occasionally requests but mostly forgets to finish. You put the oatmeal on to cook and go back to the pantry, and this time you stand there for a moment longer than usual, just looking. Not because anything is missing or out of place, but because you are doing your Tuesday morning inventory, the quiet mental accounting that every woman who runs a household does automatically, whether she calls it that or not. You are reading the pantry the way a pilot reads instruments, taking in the state of everything at a glance, and making instantaneous calculations about what needs to happen before the week is out. The Crisco's fine, about 2/3 of the way through this tin, and you will need a new one before next Monday. The Campbell's tomato soup, of which there are 4 cans standing in a neat row on the bottom shelf, is probably enough to get through Thursday, but only if you do not also make the cream of tomato casserole your mother-in-law asked about on the telephone, which she almost certainly will ask about again when she arrives Friday. Because she always asks about that casserole, you make a mental note, 2 more cans of tomato soup on the list. The Heinz white vinegar is nearly full, a large glass jug sitting at the end of the 3rd shelf with a few inches of clear liquid catching the morning light. You bought it 3 weeks ago, and you have been through barely a quarter of it, which means you're in good shape there. The vinegar is not glamorous, and it is not something you would ever think to mention to anyone, but it is used for approximately 7 different things on a regular basis in this household, from the final rinse when you do the laundry, to the cleaning of the kitchen windows, to the occasional spot treatment of something that got on the tablecloth that you would rather not have to explain to your dry cleaner. The vinegar is a utility player. It does not call attention to itself. It simply gets things done and asks for nothing. Your eye moves to the baking shelf, which is the top shelf because baking supplies are not reached for every morning, only 3 or 4 times a week depending on what is needed, and so they live higher up, organised left to right in the order you tend to use them. The gold medal flour is in the large glass canister with the red lid that you bought at Woolworths in 1949, and that has been refilled so many times the label has worn off entirely, but you do not need a label. You know what is in it. Beside it sits the smaller canister with the sugar, granulated white, which is sitting low enough that you make another mental note, and beside that the Calumet baking powder in its orange tin, which is fine. Then the box of Arm & Hammer baking soda, which has been open for a while and will need to be replaced soon, not because it has gone bad in any conventional sense, but because you read somewhere, you think it was in a Good Housekeeping from 2 years ago, that open baking soda loses its effectiveness over time, and you believe this with the kind of confident certainty that comes from having read it once, and never having reason to doubt it since. The percolator begins to make its sound, that particular burbling percolation that is not quite boiling, and not quite not boiling, the sound that means coffee is happening, and that morning is committed to its own momentum now. You give the oatmeal a stir and go back to the pantry one more time because you have just remembered that you want to check the Caro syrup situation before you forget. The Caro syrup is on the 2nd shelf, the light corn syrup in its wide-mouthed bottle, sitting beside the dark Caro which you use for the pecan pie your husband likes at Thanksgiving, and the molasses cookies you make at Christmas. The light Caro is 3/4 full, which means you can get through this week's Pancake Saturday, and still have enough left for the gelatin salad you have been meaning to make for the church potluck. Gelatin salad requires Caro syrup if you want it to have the right consistency, or at least your version of gelatin salad does, which is the recipe you got from your neighbour Ruth in 1953 and have been making ever since because it is always the first thing gone from the potluck table and you have learned not to argue with results. You think about the gelatin salad for a moment while the oatmeal finishes thickening and the percolator settles into its final satisfied gurgle. The gelatin salad requires Knox unflavoured gelatin, which is on the 3rd shelf in a small cardboard box with the individual packets inside, and it requires canned fruit cocktail, which you have 2 cans of, which is exactly 1 more than you need, and it requires cream cheese, which is in the icebox, and it requires the Caro, and it requires a little salt, just a pinch, the kind of modification you have added over the years because you always add just a pinch of salt to sweet things, because that is what your grandmother did, and it works, and you do not require further justification than that. But before the bread, and before the ironing, and before the 2nd cup of coffee, there is the matter of what gets served for the week's main meals, which is a planning exercise that happens not on a pad of paper, but in the mind, distributed across the early morning tasks like background processing that runs alongside everything else. You are thinking about Thursday's tuna noodle casserole not only because it is the regular Thursday meal, and has been the regular Thursday meal since your children were small enough to eat it without comment, but because your mother-in-law is arriving Friday, and you want to have the kitchen clear and the shopping done before she gets there, so that Friday afternoon can be devoted to the kind of domestic presentation that her visits require. Your mother-in-law is not a difficult woman exactly. She's a woman with standards, which is a different thing, and her standards apply most specifically to the kitchen, where she grew up learning from her own mother, in a tradition that predates most of the products now on your shelves, and that considers from scratch the default and shortcuts the exception. You are fond of your mother-in-law in the specific way that you are fond of someone who makes you work harder than you would otherwise need to, and whose judgment, though occasionally delivered with more certainty than the situation requires, is generally sound. You keep this fondness in a private register, and it does not require expression. What it requires is a refrigerator with the remains of no meals more than 2 days old when she arrives, a kitchen floor clean enough that she would not find anything to say about it if she looked, and at least one dish on Friday evening that comes from genuine effort rather than convenience, something that tells her, without anyone needing to say it, that you have not abandoned the kitchen knowledge she had a hand in transmitting. You decide on the chicken and dumplings. This requires a whole chicken, which you will need to call the meat market about today if you want it fresh for Friday, and it requires the buttermilk for the dumplings, which means a trip to Kowalski's or the smaller market 2 blocks closer, and it requires 2 hours on Friday afternoon, which you're already budgeting around everything else that needs to happen that day. You add chicken to the list and buttermilk, and you make a mental note to check the sage, because your sage is in the aspirational category, and may have been sitting on that shelf long enough to have lost the intensity of flavour that the chicken and dumplings requires. You check the sage. You are right to check it. You open the jar and hold it to your nose, and the smell is there, but it is thin, a suggestion of sage rather than the real thing, and you add fresh sage from the garden, or dried sage from the store to the list without having fully decided which you want yet. The garden sage is better in the abstract, but the store-dried sage is faster, and this is Friday and not a weekend, and there is a version of domestic wisdom that knows when to choose the good enough over the perfect and does not feel guilty about it. You will decide at the store which is the correct time to decide, because that is when all the relevant information will be available to you simultaneously. The pantry in October has a specific relationship to the approaching holiday season that is already beginning to organise itself in the back of your planning mind. Thanksgiving is 6 weeks away, and Thanksgiving requires a specific inventory. The dark caro for the pecan pie, which you have, and the canned pumpkin, Libby's, which you need 2 cans of and currently have none, and the sweetened condensed milk for the pumpkin custard that your husband prefers to regular pumpkin pie, and the whole spices in the little tins, the allspice and the cloves and the whole nutmeg that you grate yourself on the small metal grater rather than using the pre-ground, because this is one of the places where whole is genuinely worth the extra step, and you know it from experience. You add canned pumpkin to the list with a note that says 2 and underline it, because you have been caught short before, and you remember the specific quality of the feeling when you realise on the Tuesday before Thanksgiving that you are missing the one item that the one dish requires, and the knowledge of that feeling is sufficient motivation to add the underline. The dried fruits are also in the pre-holiday inventory, the raisins and the currants, and the dried cranberries that are not yet the ubiquitous pantry item they will eventually become, but that you have been buying since a neighbour introduced you to them in a wild rice stuffing recipe 3 years ago, and the candied peel, orange and lemon, that goes into the Christmas fruitcake that you start in November, because it needs time to ripen. The fruitcake is a subject on which your family is divided along lines so predictable that you no longer bother to negotiate them. Your husband is ambivalent, your mother-in-law is enthusiastic, your children are suspicious, and you yourself find the whole project enormously satisfying in the particular way of recipes that require planning and patience, and result in something that is genuinely improved by time. You add candied peel to the list and then cross it off again because November is not yet and you are trying to keep the list manageable. The Watkins vanilla extract is running low. You can see this without taking the bottle off the shelf because the bottle is glass and translucent, and the level of the dark liquid is below the point at which you feel comfortable, which is about 1/3 full. Because vanilla is used in nearly everything sweet, and running out of it in the middle of a recipe is the kind of domestic emergency that is entirely preventable and that you find indefensible in yourself. Vanilla goes on the list. You use the Watkins rather than the store brand because the flavour is genuinely more complex, and because your mother used Watkins and her cakes tasted the way cakes are supposed to taste, and you're not inclined to experiment with variables that are not broken. There is one more thing in the pantry that requires attention this morning, and that you have been meaning to address for 2 weeks, which is the state of the home canning jars on the bottom shelf. You put up tomatoes in August, 12 quarts from the garden, and pickles and green beans and a small batch of the strawberry jam that your eldest picked specifically because he wanted to help, which meant the process took twice as long, and the jam is irregular in its set but entirely fine in its flavour, and is eaten with the particular pleasure of something that was made with visible effort by a small person who is proud of it. The jars from August are sealed and stored and in good order, but there are also 4 empty quart jars with their lids and bands sitting on the shelf in a way that suggests they belong there but are actually a temporary parking situation that has become permanent by default, and you take them out and put them in the cabinet under the counter where the canning equipment lives, which takes 30 seconds and produces the small proprietary satisfaction of a task that has been waiting that is now done. The home canning is one of the places where the 20th century is sitting directly on top of the 19th in your kitchen. The mason jar, patented in 1858 and still in use in essentially its original form, represents a technology that predates every branded product in your pantry by decades, and that functions not because anyone is promoting it, or because it is convenient in the way that the Jell-O molds are convenient, but because it works, and because it connects the kitchen to the garden in a direct and functional way that the canning companies have not entirely displaced despite decades of effort. You have a ball blue book of canning that your mother gave you when you married, and it has been opened so many times that the spine is soft and the pages are stained in the way that the most reliable cookbooks always become stained by use. The oatmeal is ready. You dish it into 2 bowls for the children and set them at the table with the brown sugar bowl and the small ceramic pitcher of milk from the bottle in the icebox door. Your husband comes downstairs in his good trousers and his blue shirt with the small check, and you pour his coffee and hand it to him without being asked because you have been married for 11 years, and you know that his first requirement of the morning is coffee in his hand before he has to think about anything else, and you consider this knowledge a form of practical intelligence. You fry his eggs in the Crisco, which by now has gone transparent in the skillet with a faint shimmer that means the temperature is right. The eggs slide out of the shell cleanly, which is the sign of a fresh egg, and you cook them until the whites are set and the yolks are still glossy, just the way he likes them, because learning how someone likes their eggs is one of the pieces of domestic knowledge that sounds trivial and is not trivial at all. You slide them onto the plate beside the 2 pieces of toast you made from the loaf of Wonder Bread that lives in the bread box on the counter, which you have spread with butter, because today is not a margarine day, and you have decided this unilaterally and without discussion. You sit down with your own single egg and your coffee, and the children eat their oatmeal with what can charitably be described as moderate enthusiasm, and for a few minutes the kitchen has the particular quality of a weekday morning that is going according to schedule, which is not a dramatic quality, and is not the sort of thing that anyone would describe as beautiful, but which you know, somewhere in the part of yourself that keeps quiet records of such things, is actually quite good. The children leave for school at 7:20, and your husband leaves at past, and the kitchen is yours. This is the moment you have been moving towards since 6:15, not because you need silence, not exactly, but because there is a different quality to work that gets done without the constant interruption of other people's requirements, and you have learned to value the 2 hours between the family leaving and the real work of the day getting fully underway. You pour yourself a second cup of coffee and take it with you to the pantry door, where you stand and look at it properly for the first time this morning, doing the full accounting rather than the quick scan. The pantry in October of 1956 is a specific and particular thing. It is not the pantry from the Swan's Down cake flour advertisement in the Ladies' Home Journal, which shows a pantry that is not a pantry so much as an architectural fantasy, all wide open and gleaming, with supplies arranged at artful angles and nothing that has ever been opened and put back slightly crooked, or has a label that has been smudged by a wet hand. Your pantry is the real version of that pantry, which means it is functional and organised and full of things that work, and also contains 2 cans of something called Vitapack mixed vegetables, that you bought at a sale in August of 1954 and have been meaning to use ever since and will probably continue meaning to use for another year at minimum. You go through the shelves in your mind the way you do every Tuesday, and you think not just about what is running low but about what is there and what it is for. The evaporated milk, 2 cans of carnation sitting on the bottom shelf beside the condensed milk, which is a different thing entirely even though they are in nearly identical cans. And you learned this distinction the expensive way in the first year of your marriage when you used one where you should have used the other in a cream pie filling, and the result was something that technically qualified as pie, but had opinions about itself that no pie should have. The evaporated milk is for the mashed potatoes when you want them particularly rich, and for the cream soups, and for the occasional custard, and for the coffee when the fresh milk runs out before the dairy delivery, which happens approximately twice a month regardless of your best planning. The condensed milk, on the other hand, is for the fudge, and for the sweetened whipped cream when you are feeling indulgent, and for the occasional no-bake dessert that you pull out when there is not enough time to do things properly, and you need something that will still look like you made an effort. The condensed milk is a secret weapon, in the way that all convenience is a secret weapon, which is to say that it works perfectly well, and no one needs to know the details. Next to the evaporated milk, the canned tomatoes, which you buy in 3 forms: whole, crushed, and paste. The whole tomatoes are for the beef stew and for the tomato soup that you make from scratch when you have the time and inclination, which is less often than you once imagined and more often than your sister-in-law thinks you do. The crushed tomatoes are for the spaghetti sauce, which your family calls Italian sauce even though it is your own recipe, and has about as much to do with Italy as your kitchen has to do with Rome, which is to say it has the spirit of the thing, even if the geography is approximate. The paste, the small can of contadina, is the intensifier, the thing that takes whatever you are making and gives it a depth that plain tomatoes cannot achieve on their own. You use only a spoonful at a time, and you've been working through the same can since April, tightly wrapped in wax paper and tucked into the corner of the icebox door between uses, which is perhaps not exactly what the can recommends, but which has worked fine so far. You're moving now. The coffee has found its way into your bloodstream and you have shifted from the morning's soft orientation into the day's actual forward motion. You take the bread bag off the counter and look at it. There are 6 slices remaining from the loaf you opened Sunday, which is fine for today's lunches but means you will need to make bread this afternoon if you want to have enough for the week, or you will need to stop at the bakery on the way to your mother's Thursday, which is possible but adds a step to an already full day. You decide you will make bread. This decision is not dramatic. It is simply the kind of calculation that happens dozens of times a day in a household that runs on its own internal economics, where the currency is time and labour, and the exchange rate is always shifting depending on what else needs to happen. Making bread takes most of an afternoon when you account for the rising, but it requires your hands only intermittently, which means you can also do the ironing and write out the shopping list and call Ruth back about the potluck while the bread is doing what bread does on its own. You go to the pantry for the yeast, which is in the small packages, Fleischmann's Active Dry, sitting in the door of the icebox because that is where yeast lives and where it stays reliable. And while you are there, you also take a mental note of the state of the icebox itself because the icebox is an extension of the pantry, in the way that your mind is an extension of your plans, which is to say constantly and necessarily. The icebox holds the butter, unsalted, which you buy by the pound and cut into quarters and wrap in wax paper with a firmness that suggests you have thought about the correct way to do this and arrived at a conclusion. The butter is joined by the eggs, the milk in its wax-coated paper carton from Borden, the leftover pot roast from Sunday still in its covered casserole dish, the cream cheese for the gelatin salad, and a small bowl of Jell-O lemon pudding that one of the children started and did not finish, and that has been moved to progressively more visible positions over the past 2 days in an effort to encourage someone to finish it before it has to be thrown away. Back to the pantry. You're thinking about the bread and already arranging the rest of the afternoon around it in your mind, the way a logistics coordinator arranges shipments around available capacity, which is exactly what you are even though no one has ever called it that. You reach for the gold medal flour canister and set it on the counter. You check the sugar level more carefully this time, tipping the canister slightly toward the light to judge the depth of the white granules. You have maybe a cup and a half, which is enough for the bread and enough for tonight's dessert if you go simple and make the butterscotch pudding from the Jell-O box, but not enough for both the dessert and the batch of peanut butter cookies you told the children you might make this week. You add sugar to the list, 2 pounds, and then think about it and change it to 3 pounds, because you have been at the bottom of the sugar canister before, and it is not a comfortable place to be when you are mid-recipe and the batter is waiting. The Jell-O pudding mix is on the third shelf, 6 boxes in different flavours arranged in a row like a small colourful audience. Butterscotch, chocolate, vanilla, lemon, coconut cream, and the tapioca that nobody has strong feelings about, but that you keep on hand because it is useful and because there is something to be said for keeping options available. The Jell-O is a mid-century pantry staple in the truest sense, meaning it is simultaneously a dessert, an ingredient, a convenience, and a social expectation. Because there is a layer of domestic life in 1956 in which showing up to a gathering without a gelatin dish is a statement you might not mean to make, but will definitely make. You keep your Jell-O stocked the way you keep your stockings mended. It is not a preference, it is a responsibility. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. Beside the pudding mixes are the gelatin moulds in the unflavoured Knox variety, already noted, and beside those is a box of cornstarch, which is smaller than it used to be because you have been thickening gravies and puddings and the occasional pie filling at a pace that has quietly depleted it to about a third of a box, and you add it to the list. Cornstarch is the kind of thing you do not think about until you reach for it and find there is not enough, at which moment it becomes the most important thing in the kitchen, and you've been doing this long enough to anticipate that moment rather than experience it. The salt is not really on the pantry shelf so much as it lives beside the stove, in the small ceramic salt box with the wooden lid that your mother gave you when you got married, which holds Morton's table salt and which you refill from the round blue canister on the pantry shelf about twice a month. The Morton's canister has its familiar little girl with her umbrella and the instruction that when it rains it pours, which you have read so many times it has stopped meaning anything in particular and has simply become part of the texture of the kitchen, like the wallpaper and the sound the refrigerator makes at night. Salt goes on the list anyway, because the canister is light in a way that your wrist tells you even before your eyes confirm it. Beside the salt canister is the pepper, in a small glass jar with a metal shaker top, black pepper ground fine, and beside that is a row of smaller spice jars that you have collected and organised over the years, and that represent what you think of as your active spice collection, as distinct from the jars at the back of the shelf that you think of as your aspirational spice collection, which contains things like mace and cardamom and dried rosemary that you bought with the full intention of using them, and that have been waiting patiently for the right recipe to arrive. The active spices are paprika, which you use on deviled eggs and on the top of anything creamy that you're putting under the broiler, and cinnamon for the rolls and the oatmeal and the applesauce, and nutmeg for the eggnog at Christmas, and for the cream sauces when you remember, and celery salt, which is different from regular salt in a specific and important way that you could not entirely articulate but can absolutely taste, and garlic salt, which you use in salad dressings and in the meatloaf, and in approximately everything else that needs a little something you cannot quite name, because garlic salt is the mid-century kitchen's answer to the question of what is missing, and the answer is almost always garlic salt. You begin the bread. You warm the water first, testing it on the inside of your wrist the way you would test a baby's bottle, because the temperature of the water is one of those specific variables in bread making that has an immediate and unforgiving effect on whether the yeast wakes up or stays dormant, and you learned this early enough in your cooking life that it is now a reflex rather than a deliberate thought. The yeast goes into the warm water with a pinch of the sugar, and you set it aside to prove while you measure the flour into the large ceramic mixing bowl, the tan one with the blue stripe around the rim that is heavy enough that your wrists know they have been used after a long session of mixing. While you wait for the yeast, you think about what else needs to happen this week. The can of chicken of the sea tuna on the second shelf, which is for Thursday's tuna noodle casserole, the family meal so embedded in the weekly rotation that your children would notice its absence the way they would notice if a piece of furniture had moved, is sufficient. You have 2 cans and you have the cream of mushroom soup that goes into it, 2 cans of Campbell's sitting beside the tomato soup like close relatives at a family gathering. The egg noodles are in their cellophane bag, Ronco brand, hanging from the small hook on the inside of the pantry door because the bag has a hanger on it, and this seems like information worth using. The breadcrumbs are in a round cardboard canister beside the spices, Progresso Italian style, and there are enough for the casserole topping plus the meatloaf, and this also goes into the mental ledger as sufficient. The Worcestershire sauce is in the door of the pantry on the small shelf you use for bottles, tall and narrow in its dark glass with the distinctive Lee & Perrins label that has not changed meaningfully in decades, and that you would recognize in any grocery store in any city in America from 20 feet away without your glasses. Worcestershire goes into the meatloaf, into the beef stew, into the occasional cocktail sauce, and into a small amount of other things with which it improves the flavour in a way that is out of all proportion to the modest spoonful you use, which is the defining characteristic of the condiments and seasoning agents that earn permanent pantry placement. They cost very little, they take up very little space, and their absence in a dish is immediately noticeable, while their presence is responsible for a quality that people taste and cannot name. This is the great pantry secret, that the things doing the most important work are often the smallest and least expensive and most easily overlooked. The yeast is ready, bubbling with a quiet confidence in its little bowl, and you stir it into the flour with the salt and a spoonful of Crisco from the tin, because the Crisco is not only for the skillet and not only for the pie crusts and the biscuits and the occasional deep frying, it is also for the bread, where it produces a softness and a keeping quality that the old lard-based recipes had, but that the newer health consciousness has begun to make people feel vaguely uncertain about, even as the Crisco companies are doing their level best to reassure everyone that vegetable shortening is not only fine but superior, an argument you find mostly persuasive and mostly beside the point, because the bread comes out the way your family likes it, and that is the entire evaluation. You knead the dough for 8 minutes by the kitchen clock, counting not the minutes exactly but the rhythm, the push and fold and quarter turn and push again that your hands know the way they know how to type or how to braid your daughter's hair, through enough repetition that the knowledge has moved from the conscious mind into the hands themselves. The dough becomes smooth and elastic under your palms, and you put it into the large bowl that you have greased with a thin smear of Crisco, cover it with a clean kitchen towel, and set it beside the stove where it is warm enough to rise without being too close to direct heat. Then you wash your hands and pour your third cup of coffee of the morning, which is not something you would admit to your doctor, and you stand at the kitchen window for a moment and look at the backyard. The backyard in October is past its prime, the garden cleaned out weeks ago, the tomato cages stacked in the corner by the garage, the dahlias that you're particularly proud of having been deadheaded and cut back for the season. The clothesline is empty. The apple tree, which gave you perhaps 3 bushels worth of apples this year, and that you spent most of September dealing with in various forms, has lost most of its leaves and is settling into the particular skeletal dignity of late autumn. It is a perfectly ordinary backyard in a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning, and you look at it for about 30 seconds before your eyes shift to the stove and you remember that you need to get the ironing board set up before the bread finishes its first rise and needs punching down. The ironing board lives in the hall closet, behind the vacuum cleaner and the box of Christmas decorations that has been in the same place since last January, and that will stay there until the day after Thanksgiving when you take it down with the ritual mixture of effort and pleasure that marks the beginning of the holiday season. You take out the ironing board and the iron, the heavy Sunbeam steam iron that you bought at Sears in 1953, and that has been one of the most reliable objects in your household, which is a low bar to clear, but which it clears with consistency and without complaint. You plug it in and wait for it to heat while you sort through the basket. The basket contains, in descending order of urgency, your husband's 4 work shirts, your own house dress that needs its collar touched up, 2 of the children's school blouses, the tablecloth that you use Sunday, and that has been sitting in the basket because it is large and ironing it requires a degree of commitment that you have been building up to, and a pair of your husband's cotton trousers that you iron every 2 weeks whether or not he mentions them, which is a small domestic negotiation that you have made with yourself about the maintenance of standards versus the reality of available time, and about which you feel fine. You begin with the shirts because the shirts are the priority, and because doing the priority item first is how you have always worked, which is its own kind of philosophy even if you have never thought of it in those terms. The steam iron goes across the collar first, then the cuffs, then the front placket, then the sleeves, then the back, then the front panels in 2 passes, and then you button the top button and hang it on the hanger on the back of the pantry door, where the other finished shirts will join it until your husband takes them to his closet. You have ironed shirts in this sequence so many times that you could do it in your sleep, and sometimes you essentially are, moving through the motions with the competent automatic quality of deep expertise, your mind partly on the shirt and partly on the potluck, and partly on the fact that you need to call the meat market about the roast you want for Sunday. The bread dough is rising. You can see it pressing against the towel as you pass the stove on your way to the kitchen for more coffee, and you feel the small proprietary satisfaction of something working the way it is supposed to work. The Fleischmann's yeast has done its job, which it does reliably, which is why you have never switched to anything else. Not because you have not had opportunities to try other things, but because the Fleischmann's does what it says it will do, and you find great value in things that do what they say they will do. You finish the shirts and move to the tablecloth, spreading it across the ironing board in sections and working from the centre out toward the edges, the way your mother showed you, and that minimises the chance of pressing a wrinkle into the fabric rather than out of it. The tablecloth is cotton damask, ivory, with a faint raised pattern of leaves and wheat sheaves, and it was a wedding gift from your aunt in Columbus that you have been taking careful care of for 11 years. Ironing it takes 15 minutes and requires a kind of focused attention that the shirts do not, because the damask pattern needs to be followed rather than fought against, and you learn the territory of this tablecloth again every time you iron it, the same way you learn a piece of music every time you play it, even when you already know it well. While you're ironing, you're also thinking. This is the deep background function of ironing, and of most of the daily domestic work, that the hands are occupied, and the mind is free to roam the practical landscape of the week ahead. You think about the gelatin salad, and decide you will make it Wednesday afternoon so it has time to set fully overnight in the icebox. You think about your mother-in-law, and whether she will want the bedroom or the sewing room when she stays Friday, and you decide she will want the bedroom, which she always wants, and that you will put the ironing board away and make the sewing room presentable by Thursday evening. You think about the children's Halloween costumes, which need to be done before Saturday, and you feel the specific low-level tension of a deadline that is entirely manageable if addressed promptly, and that will become considerably less manageable if not. You add costume supplies to the list. The bread needs punching down. You go to it, pull back the towel and press your fist into the dome of risen dough, which deflates with a soft sigh that is one of the better sounds in the domestic repertoire, a sound of successful biology, of something working. You turn the dough over, shape it back into a ball, cover it again, and give it another 45 minutes. Then you go back to the ironing. By 11 o'clock the ironing is done and the basket is empty and the shirts are hanging and the tablecloth is folded and back in the linen drawer. The bread has finished its second rise and is shaped and in the pan and going into the oven at 350 degrees, and the smell that begins to come from it within 20 minutes is the smell that you cannot replicate with any store-bought bread, and that is, if you are being honest with yourself, one of the genuine small pleasures of this particular life. Not the labour, the result of the labour. The house smelling like fresh bread on a Tuesday morning in October, when the world outside is going grey, and the heat is just beginning to come up in the furnace and everything inside is warm and specific and deliberately made. You go back to the pantry one more time, not to take inventory and not to plan, but for the small jar of Heinz chili sauce on the second shelf that you want to add to the soup you're making for lunch, because the tomato soup from the can is perfectly adequate on its own, and the children prefer it that way. But you are home and it is Tuesday, and you have time to make it something more than adequate for yourself, so you add the chili sauce and a spoonful of the Worcestershire and let it simmer in the small pot while the bread bakes, and you pour a second bowl without the modifications for whoever comes home asking for it tonight. The pantry that made this morning is not a magazine pantry. It is not an aspirational pantry photographed under studio lights with every label facing forward and every shelf spaced so generously you could put your hand in flat and not touch anything. It is a working pantry, organised by function and frequency, and the accumulated wisdom of years of figuring out what is always needed, and what is occasionally needed, and what you thought you needed, and have revised your opinion on. It holds the things that made breakfast possible, and the things that will make dinner possible, and the things that kept yesterday's meal from tasting like yesterday's meal, and the things that are sitting in the back waiting for a recipe that may or may not arrive. It is the material basis of daily life in a particular household in a particular decade, and it is organised not by any system from a magazine, but by the specific intelligence of the person who uses it every day, and who has become, through that daily use, a kind of expert in her own right, even if no one has ever called it that, and she would not particularly think to call it that herself. The bread comes out at 12:10, golden and domed and smelling exactly the way it is supposed to smell. You turn it out onto the cooling rack and tap the bottom, which sounds hollow, which is the right sound, which means it is done. You set it to cool for the required 20 minutes, which is approximately 15 minutes longer than anyone in this house will wait once they can smell it, And you go to the telephone on the wall to call Ruth about the potluck, and while the telephone rings, you lean against the counter and look at the pantry door, still standing slightly open, the way it does when the latch does not quite catch, and you think that you should probably have someone look at that latch before winter, and you add it to the list. The afternoon, when it comes, has the particular quality of Tuesday afternoons in households where the morning has gone according to plan, which is a quality of earned quiet, of a house that has been worked and fed and organised, and now sits in its own warmth, while someone moves through it on tasks that require less urgency. You slice the bread while it is still warm, against all reasonable instruction, because there is no point in having principles if you cannot occasionally set them aside in favour of the obvious right choice, and you eat a heel of it standing at the counter with a thin spread of butter, and it is very good, and you know it is very good, and you do not require anyone's confirmation of this. This is the other thing about the working pantry and the working kitchen, the thing that the magazine photograph never quite captures, and perhaps is not really trying to, the competence. The deep, accumulating, unhurried competence of someone who has been doing a specific thing for long enough to do it well, who has made the bread fail and made it succeed enough times to understand the difference, who has learned through repetition and attention and the occasional expensive mistake what each element of the pantry is for and when it is needed and what happens if it runs out. There is a particular kind of intelligence that lives in a well-run pantry, and it is not decorative, and it is not domestic in the small, dismissive sense that the word sometimes gets used, and it does not look like anything special from the outside because its whole function is to be invisible when it is working. It is working today. The bread is made, the ironing is done, the list is growing, the plans for the week are organised in a mind that holds several simultaneous threads of domestic logistics with the same natural facility that a good engineer holds simultaneous structural calculations. There is a church potluck to supply, and a mother-in-law to host, and a Halloween costume to complete, and a meatloaf to make, and a tuna noodle casserole on Thursday, and all of it is accounted for in the pantry, which is to say all of it is accounted for in you. Because the pantry does not manage itself. Someone put everything in it, someone keeps track of what it holds, and someone knows what is missing before it is missing, and puts it on the list before the gap becomes a crisis. That someone is you, and you are having your fourth cup of coffee of the day, which is the one you have already decided not to count, and you're sitting in the kitchen with the afternoon light coming through the window, and the bread cooling on the rack, and the list on the counter, and somewhere in the back of your mind you are already thinking about Wednesday. The American Housewife in 1956 is not the same consumer that Procter & Gamble was marketing Crisco to in 1912, and the transformation between those two women is itself a part of the Crisco story that gets lost in the simpler narrative of a product being invented and then being used. The woman of 1912 was being asked to change a habit. The woman of 1956 was simply continuing one, and that is a profoundly different relationship to a product, and it required a profoundly different kind of marketing to maintain. By the mid-1950s, Procter & Gamble had been producing Crisco for more than 4 decades, and the product had accumulated the particular cultural gravity of things that have been around long enough to feel inevitable. A generation of women had learned to cook with Crisco from their mothers, who had learned from their mothers in some cases, or who had made the original transition themselves and been so thoroughly satisfied with the results that they never looked back. The Crisco recipe booklets, which continued to be produced and updated through the decades, had by the 50s become something like an institution, a brand-printed cookbook that sat in kitchen drawers and on recipe shelves across the country with the same unpretentious functionality as the Churchwomen's Auxiliary Cookbook and the Betty Crocker Cookbook, neither aspirational nor particularly fashionable, but reliably used. The Betty Crocker connection is worth dwelling on for a moment, because the relationship between the Crisco brand and the home economics movement and the various branded recipe and cooking authorities of the mid-century was not accidental. Betty Crocker was not a person. She was a composite persona, created by General Mills in 1921 to put a human face on the company's consumer communications, and the image of the pleasant, capable, authoritative domestic expert that Betty Crocker embodied was exactly the kind of cultural figure that Crisco needed to be associated with, because Betty Crocker baked, and Betty Crocker baked with shortening, and shortening meant Crisco. The two brands were not in the same company, but they inhabited the same domestic universe, and they reinforced each other's legitimacy, the way all the domestic authority figures of the era reinforced each other. Through the shared assumption that there was a correct way to run a household, and that the correct way involved the correct products used in the correct amounts, according to the correct recipes. Procter & Gamble also had its own cooking authority figures, the home economists who worked in the company's test kitchens, and whose work produced the recipes in the Crisco booklets, and the scripts for the Crisco radio programs, and eventually the television advertisements that began reaching American households in the late 1940s and through the 50s. These were real women with real cooking knowledge, trained in the scientific cooking tradition of the home economics schools, who tested recipes systematically and who produced results that could be replicated by a home cook who followed the instructions carefully. Their work was genuine, the recipes were genuinely good, and the authority with which those recipes were presented, the authority of the institutional kitchen rather than the individual household, was genuine in the sense that it was based on real testing and real expertise, even as it was also a commercial argument for a specific product. The radio programs deserve particular attention because they were one of the primary vehicles through which Crisco, and American processed food more generally, entered the domestic imagination in the decades before television. Daytime radio in the 1930s and 40s was the media environment of the American housewife, in a way that no other medium has quite replicated since, because it was domestic in its very nature, designed to accompany the household tasks of women who were at home during the hours between the children leaving for school and coming home, hours that were full of the physical labour of cooking and cleaning and laundry and ironing, but that also had space for a voice coming through the radio on the kitchen counter to discuss recipes and household management, and the proper use of baking shortening in a way that was simultaneously informative and companionable and subtly commercial. The soap opera, a cultural form whose name preserves the commercial relationship from which it emerged, was another product of this radio to housewife pipeline, and the same companies that sponsored the serial dramas also sponsored the cooking programs, creating a continuous branded environment that the listening housewife inhabited for hours each day. Procter & Gamble was one of the most significant sponsors of this radio programming, which was not coincidental. They understood the medium, they understood the audience, and they had a range of products, of which Crisco was one of the most prominent, that benefited from the daily domestic context in which the programming was consumed. The wartime years between 1941 and 1945 created an unexpected marketing challenge for the Crisco brand, because the fat rationing that the government imposed as part of the war mobilization restricted the availability of cooking fats, including vegetable shortening, and the careful management of scarce resources that rationing required was in direct tension with the abundance narrative that had surrounded Crisco's marketing since its introduction. Procter & Gamble navigated this by pivoting to a conservation message, producing materials about how to get the most from limited fat supplies, how to save and reuse fat wisely, how to make what you have go further, which was a very different kind of domestic authority from the gleaming abundance of the pre-war advertising, but that served the same underlying function of positioning the company as a trusted domestic advisor rather than simply a product seller. The fat-saving campaigns of the war years also produced the rendered fat collection programs that remain one of the more unusual footnotes of wartime domestic life. The government's request that American households save their used cooking fat and return it to collection points, where it would be processed for use in the manufacture of glycerin, which was needed for munitions. The instruction went out through women's magazines and radio programs and school programs and church bulletins, and the fat collection became part of the war effort in the specific domestic register in which women participated in that effort, through the management of the household's material resources in service of a larger national purpose. Millions of pounds of fat were collected this way. Whether it was actually used for the purpose claimed, or whether the program was as much about civilian morale and the sense of participation as about the glycerin itself, is a question that historians have debated, but the fat collection exists as evidence of the genuine connection between the mid-century kitchen and the national life in ways that extended well beyond the commercial transactions of the grocery store. After the war, Crisco's marketing returned to abundance, and then some. The post-war consumer economy was in an expansive mood that the food companies were eager to encourage, and Crisco was well positioned to benefit from the suburban housing boom, the larger kitchens with their modern appliances, the expanding household budgets, and the cultural emphasis on the housewife as a domestic professional whose kitchen management was a measure of her modernity. The Crisco advertisements of the late 40s and through the 50s showed women who were competent, purposeful, and pleased with their results, which was a more nuanced portrait than the passive domestic ideal that gets retrospectively applied to the era, and which reflected the actual complexity of the consumer relationship between the brand and its users. The competition that Crisco faced in the post-war era was also expanding. Spry, the Lever Brothers product, was the most direct competitor, but there were also house brands from the major grocery chains and regional shortening products, and increasingly, the newer cooking oils in liquid form, Wesson and Mazola and others, that offered an alternative to solid shortening for some applications. Procter & Gamble responded to this competition with continued recipe development and the television advertising that began to reach its stride in the early 1950s, and with a sustained presence in the recipe booklets and women's magazine, advertising that had defined the brand from the beginning. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. What Crisco had that most of its competitors could not easily replicate was the weight of accumulated habit, the fact that millions of American women had learned to bake with it and had produced consistent and good results and had no particular reason to change. Habit is the most durable marketing asset in the consumer goods business, more durable than any advertising campaign, and more persuasive than any product claim, because habit does not require ongoing reinforcement from the outside. It runs on its own, replenishing itself each time the tin is emptied and replaced, each time the recipe calls for shortening, and the hand reaches automatically for the blue and white container on the second shelf. Take a moment with that, because what comes next belongs to the same world, even if it looks different from the outside. The pantry you've been moving through all morning was filled with specific products made by specific companies, and those companies did not arrive in the American kitchen by accident. They were invented, marketed, argued over, and in at least one case, built from the ground up by a group of people who understood something very important about what American women were going to need before those women had quite finished understanding it themselves. And none of that story is better told than through the story of Crisco. In 1911, the Procter & Gamble company introduced a product called Crisco to the American market, and in doing so changed the way a nation cooked, baked, and thought about the fat in its food. This was not an accident. It was the result of years of scientific research, corporate strategy, and an unusually sophisticated understanding of how to turn a new product into a domestic necessity. And to understand why Crisco mattered, and why it became one of the most successful food products in American history, you have to understand what the American kitchen was working with before it arrived. In the first decade of the 20th century, American home cooks had a limited roster of fats to work with. Lard was the oldest and most common, rendered from pork fat and used for everything from pie crust to frying, to the occasional soap, a product so fundamental to the American household that its disappearance from the pantry would have registered as a genuine emergency. Butter was there too, expensive and variable in quality, better for some applications than others, beloved and finite. And then there was drippings, the collected and stored fat from cooked meat, particularly beef, which sat in a small can beside many a stove and was used with the unsentimental practicality of people who wasted nothing because wasting nothing was not a philosophy but an economic necessity. The problem with all of these fats, from the perspective of a company looking at the market with commercial ambition, was that they were variable. Lard varied by batch, by season, by the animal it came from. Butter varied by the dairy, by the time of year, by how long it had been sitting. Drippings varied by what you'd cooked last week. A home cook using these fats was working with materials that behaved differently on Tuesday than they had on Saturday, and the only way to compensate for that variability was experience, the accumulated knowledge of someone who had worked with enough fat over enough time to read it and adjust accordingly. Procter & Gamble, watching this market from the vantage point of a company that had already built a considerable business in soap and candles, saw an opportunity in that variability. What if you could offer American home cooks a fat that was always the same, that looked the same, smelled the same, behaved the same in the skillet and the mixing bowl and the pie plate, regardless of which tin you opened or which month of the year it happened to be? A fat that was stable, predictable, and marketed as clean and modern in a way that the animal-derived alternatives, with their connections to slaughterhouses and rendering plants, and the smells and textures of animal bodies, could not quite manage to be. The process that made Crisco possible was called hydrogenation, and it had been developed in Europe in the early years of the century. Hydrogenation takes liquid vegetable oil, in Crisco's case cottonseed oil, and forces hydrogen gas through it, under pressure in the presence of a catalyst, transforming the liquid fat into a solid or semi-solid one by chemically altering the structure of the fatty acids. The result is a white, creamy, shelf-stable fat that behaves like lard in many applications, but comes from plants rather than animals, and has a neutral flavour that does not compete with whatever you are cooking. Procter & Gamble acquired the American rights to a hydrogenation patent in 1907, and spent the next several years refining the process and the product and thinking very carefully about how to introduce it to the American market. They understood that they were not simply selling a new product. They were asking American women to change a habit that was centuries old, to replace the fat they had been using their entire lives with something invented in a laboratory, and to trust that this laboratory product was not only safe but superior. This was a significant ask, and Procter & Gamble was not going to approach it casually. The product was given a name, Crisco, a word that had no meaning in any language but that sounded modern and clean and slightly scientific, and that was short enough to fit on a tin label with room to spare. The tin itself was designed deliberately, white and blue and round, suggesting cleanliness and efficiency and a certain domestic seriousness. And then came the marketing campaign, which was one of the most sophisticated and far-reaching product launches that the American food market had seen up to that point. Procter & Gamble sent free samples to grocers, home economists, cooking teachers, and railroad dining car chefs. They published a recipe booklet, which was given away free with every tin, containing recipes specifically developed to showcase what Crisco could do that lard could not do quite as cleanly or predictably. They ran advertisements in women's magazines, which were the primary vehicle for reaching the domestic consumer, and those advertisements did not simply praise the product, they made an argument. The argument was essentially this: Crisco is pure, Crisco is clean, Crisco is scientific, and by extension, lard and other animal fats, however familiar and functional, were none of those things in quite the same modern sense. The word pure was doing enormous work in those early Crisco advertisements, and it was doing that work in more than one register simultaneously. Pure meant free from contamination, which was a genuinely relevant concern in an era of widespread food adulteration and the still fresh memory of Upton Sinclair's 1906 novel about the meatpacking industry, which had done more for food reform consciousness in America than any government report had managed. Pure meant clean, unconnected to the processes of slaughter and rendering that produced lard, a fat whose animal origins were not exactly hidden, but were not something the advertisements dwelt on. And pure meant modern, scientific, controlled, produced under conditions of industrial hygiene that the home rendering of the lard simply could not match. The campaign worked, not immediately and not universally, but steadily and with increasing force over the following decades. Crisco found its way into American kitchens first, among those most susceptible to the arguments of scientific domesticity. The women who read the women's magazines and attended the home economics courses and were invested in the idea that modern housekeeping was a discipline with correct and incorrect methods that could be learned and applied. These early adopters demonstrated the product to their neighbours and their daughters and their church auxiliary groups, and the product demonstrated itself in the mixing bowl and the skillet, because it genuinely did produce consistent results, and consistency is its own argument. By the 1920s, Crisco was in kitchens across America. By the 30s, it had become so embedded in the American pantry that its presence was assumed, and its absence, when rationing during the Second World War created genuine shortages, was felt as a genuine deprivation by a generation of home cooks who had grown up with it. By the 1950s, the decade you have just spent your morning inside, Crisco was simply part of what a stocked pantry contained, as natural and unremarkable as the flour or the salt, a product so successfully integrated into domestic life that most of the women who used it daily could not have told you very much about where it came from or what it was made of, only that it worked and that it was always the same. The recipe booklets that Procter & Gamble produced were themselves a remarkable piece of culinary engineering. The first one, published in 1912 and simply called Crisco, a new shortening, was 600 recipes long. which was not a recipe booklet in any conventional sense, but rather a comprehensive cooking education, all of it built around the assumption that Crisco was the correct fat for every application. The booklet covered pastry and bread and cake and cookies and frying and sautéing and soup, and it was written in the language of home economics, precise and measured and slightly authoritative, the voice of someone who knew better and was sharing the knowledge generously. It reached Jewish home cooks with a specific argument that had not appeared in mainstream food marketing before, that Crisco, being made from vegetables rather than animal fat, could be used in households that kept kosher without violating the prohibition against mixing meat and dairy, because Crisco was neither. This was a real and practical benefit, and it opened a market that had not previously been accessible to a mainstream American food product. The rabbit on the Crisco tin, which appeared on packaging for decades, was a reference to a particular kind of kosher certification, a nod to a specific community's needs embedded in the packaging of a product that was sold to everyone. The American Pantry of the 1950s was built on top of decisions like this, on marketing campaigns and product formulations and distribution strategies that had been unfolding for decades before the woman buying the tin at the A&P had any reason to think about them. She reached for the Crisco the way she reached for the gold medal flour, because it was what you used, because it worked, because it was what her mother used before her once the transition had been made, and because the blue and white tin on the pantry shelf was simply part of what a pantry looked like. What the advertisements never quite addressed, because they did not need to in the 1950s, was the fact that partially hydrogenated vegetable oils, the category to which Crisco belonged, contained a form of fat called trans fat, which later research would connect to increased risk of heart disease, in a finding that would, in the 1990s and 2000s, require a fundamental rethinking of what had been sold as a healthful alternative for 80 years. This information was not available to the woman in the kitchen in 1956, and it was not available because the science had not yet been done, and so she reached for the Crisco in good faith and in full confidence, because the marketing had been thorough and the performance had been consistent and there was no reason, yet, to think otherwise. Crisco underwent reformulation in 2004 to remove trans fats from the original formula, and today it is made differently than it was in your 1956 pantry. The tin still exists, still blue and white, still round, still sitting on grocery store shelves in the shortening aisle, but the product inside it is not quite the same product that your grandmother used, or that the woman doing her Tuesday morning inventory used, or that went into 10,000 pie crusts and biscuit batches and birthday cakes across half a century of American domestic life. The Crisco that changed everything is not quite there anymore. What remains is the name, the shape, the habit. And that is the story of one tin. One product among the dozens that built the post-war American pantry, each with its own history of invention and marketing and gradual integration into the daily routine, each representing a decision made somewhere by someone about what American women needed, and how to give it to them, and how to make sure they kept coming back for more. The pantry is never just a pantry. It is a record of those decisions, sitting on your shelves, waiting to be reached for. Now consider the woman who stocked those shelves. Not the woman at home doing the reaching, but the woman at the other end of the supply chain, the woman behind the counter of the grocery store, who knew more about what was in the pantry of every household in her neighborhood than any single one of those households knew about itself, because she was the one who saw what they bought every week, what they ran out of, what they bought extra of before a holiday, and what they asked about with the particular combination of hope and skepticism that meant they had read something in a magazine and were not entirely sure they believed it yet. You've been working at Kowalski's Family Grocery on Elm Street for 4 years this past September, and you have a specific understanding of this store that goes all the way down to the grain of the wooden floor under the third aisle and the slightly loose handle on the second cold case from the left, and the way the light in the produce section flickers for about 2 seconds every afternoon at approximately 3:15 for a reason that Mr. Kowalski has been meaning to look into since 1953. You're not the manager. You are what was called a sales clerk or a grocery girl, or sometimes just the woman in the red apron, and you're 24 years old, and you know this store the way the woman in the White House on Maple knows her pantry. By the accumulated intelligence of daily contact, by the repetition that becomes expertise, and by the attention that most people do not pay to the things they do every day, but that you have paid since your first week. Because attention is how you survive being on your feet for 8 hours. Your shift starts at 8 in the morning, which means you're at the store by 7:45 because you like to walk the floor before the doors open, to see what needs to be faced out and what is running low, and whether the overnight stock boy has put anything in the wrong place, which happens with a regularity that you have come to think of as one of the defining rhythms of the retail grocery business rather than a personal failing of any particular stock boy, because they are all 20 years old and they are all thinking about something other than whether the cream of wheat is in front of the oatmeal again. You change into your uniform in the back room, a clean cotton house dress in a pale blue that Mr. Kowalski had made for his 3 female employees in a gesture of brand identity that he is quietly proud of, and that the 3 of you have made a tacit agreement never to comment on either positively or negatively. Over it goes the red apron, which is full length and has 2 large pockets in the front that you use for your order pad and your pencil, and the small notepad on which you keep running totals of things you notice during your shift that need to be addressed, which is itself a practice you developed because the alternative was trying to hold all of it in your head, and the alternative did not work. You walk the floor. The store is about 4,000 square feet, small enough that you can take it all in on a single pass down the centre aisle and back along the perimeter, large enough that there are always at least 3 things requiring attention before the doors open. This morning it is the canned soup section, where the Campbell's tomato has been pulled to the front, and the chicken noodle has been left at the back where it cannot be easily reached, which is not how anyone who has ever worked a retail floor would organise it, but which reflects the enthusiasm with which the stock boy approaches the task of making all the red cans face forward, and the corresponding absence of enthusiasm with which he approaches the rest. You reface the chicken noodle, you bring the cream of mushroom to the front of its row, you do the same for the bean with bacon, and the chicken with rice and the pepper pot, which almost nobody buys, but which Mr. Kowalski continues to stock, because he is attached to it for reasons he has never explained and that you have decided not to ask about. The shortening section is 3 shelves on the right side of the baking aisle, and it is one of the most reliably high traffic sections in the store, because almost everyone who bakes needs it, and almost everyone who bakes needs it regularly. Crisco dominates the shelf, as it has since before you started here, taking up the centre 2 shelves and most of the face-out space with its blue and white tins in 2 sizes, the £1 and the £3, the £1 for customers who are trying it or who have small households, the £3 for the women who bake in volume and who know that buying the larger tin works out to less per ounce, and who have done this calculation enough times that they do it automatically now without even thinking of it as math. You check the stock level, 3 £1 and 2 £3 on the shelf, which will get through the morning but not the afternoon, and you make a note on your pad for the stockroom. Beside the Crisco, the Spry. Lever Brothers' version of the vegetable shortening, in a similar tin in blue and red, sitting in Crisco's shadow with the quiet dignity of a product that works perfectly well and has been losing this particular aisle battle for decades without quite giving up. There are women who prefer Spry, not many on this block but a few, and one of them is Mrs. Halverson from Walnut Avenue, who comes in every other Tuesday and buys 2 tins of Spry and 1 of Crisco and has never offered an explanation, and you have never asked for one, because on this floor you serve rather than interrogate, and her reasons are her own. The doors open at 9. The first wave of customers is the early women, the ones who have already done their household tasks for the morning, and who are shopping as part of a planned sequence of errands, rather than because they have run out of something. These are the most organised customers, the ones who bring lists, who move through the store efficiently, and who know what they want before they arrive, and serving them is a pleasure of a specific kind, the pleasure of smooth transaction and mutual competence. You say good morning, you point them to the specials board near the door where Mr. Kowalski has written this week's sale items in his large careful print. You answer the occasional question about whether something is in stock or whether a particular brand is expected to come in. You operate the register for whoever is ready to check out, and you keep one part of your attention on the floor at all times, because the floor is your primary responsibility and it requires continuous monitoring. By 10 o'clock the store has settled into its mid-morning rhythm, which is moderately busy without being overwhelming, and you have time to move through the aisles with a small stock cart, refilling what needs refilling and noting what needs to be ordered. The vinegar shelf, which carries 3 brands, the Heinz White and the Heinz Cider, and a house brand in a plain jug that is considerably cheaper and somewhat less reliable in flavour, is running low on the Heinz White, which you expected because the Heinz White is one of those items that sells steadily and quietly, without ever causing any drama or requiring any attention, the way the best employees work, and which you order regularly enough that the gap on the shelf is always temporary. You make a note. You move to the spice section. The spice section is one of the parts of this store that requires the most maintenance for reasons that you have spent 4 years analysing and have arrived at a partial but satisfying explanation for. People touch the spices. They pick them up to read the labels, set them down in approximately but not exactly the right place, shift the rows when they are looking for something specific, and leave the section in a state of gentle disorder that compounds over the course of a busy morning into something that needs addressing before noon if the afternoon is going to be manageable. You straighten the paprika, which is always slightly out of order, because it is sold next to the cayenne and the chili powder, and customers are always confusing the three until they look closely, and you rotate the stock on the celery salt, bringing the older cans to the front, because celery salt is one of those items that technically has a shelf life but that customers will leave on the back of their pantry shelves for years without thinking about it, and the rotation means that at least the store's supply is moving in the right direction. Mrs. Peterson arrives at 10:20 with a list in a manner that suggests she is slightly behind schedule, and holds you personally responsible for this. You have known Mrs. Peterson for the 4 years you have worked here, and have developed what you would describe to a neutral observer as a working understanding of her communication style, which is to say that you understand that the impatience is systemic and not personal, and that the best way to deal with it is efficient and attentive service, which is what you provide because that is what you provide for everyone. She's looking for Knox gelatin, which you have, and for a particular kind of evaporated milk that she says she has been buying here for 3 years, and that is, she informs you, not where it usually is. You walk her to the canned milk section, which is in good order, and you show her the carnation, which is where it has always been for the entirety of your employment here, and you suggest gently that this is the product she's been buying, unless she means the pet brand, which is on the shelf to its right, or the store brand, which is below both, and her expression suggests that she considers all 3 of these options to be the right answer, presented in an unhelpful way, and you smile and tell her that they are all evaporated milk and all work the same way, which is the truth, and you let her make her choice, which she does because customers always do once the options are clear. This is the deeper skill of the grocery floor that nobody puts in any advertisement, and that no woman behind a counter gets any particular recognition for: the reading of the customer, the understanding of what they are actually asking for underneath the way they have asked for it, which is not always the same thing. Mrs. Peterson wants her evaporated milk, and she also wants to feel that she is running an orderly household, and that the products she relies on are reliable, and the mild disorientation of finding them slightly reordered on the shelf has upset that feeling, and what she needs is someone to calmly confirm that everything is in order and that she can get what she came for. You provide this. You have provided it so many times for so many customers that you do it without thinking, the way you do most things that you do well. By noon, the store has the particular quality of midday grocery traffic, the lunch hour men stopping in for something quick, the mothers who have come out while older children manage the younger ones for an hour, the occasional retired gentleman who comes in to buy one very specific thing and stays to talk for considerably longer than the purchase required. You eat your lunch in the back room in 20 minutes, a sandwich you made this morning, which is a meat and cheese on the good rye from the bakery 2 doors down, and a thermos of coffee that you have been nursing since your morning break, and you read 4 pages of the paperback you have been working through for 2 weeks, because your reading time has been compressed by the extra Rotary Club dinner your husband agreed to attend this month, which you did not realise had any implications for your schedule until it did. You go back to the floor. The afternoon has its own rhythm, slower in the early part and building toward the post-school, pre-dinner rush that begins around 3:30 and peaks at 5, when the working women stop in on their way home from offices and factories, and the mothers who were home all day suddenly need the one thing they forgot to get this morning. This is the most demanding part of your shift, not because the individual transactions are more complicated, but because the volume is higher, and the customers are more tired and more pressed, which makes them less patient and more particular, and more likely to ask you a question they have already half answered themselves, and to want you to confirm the answer rather than challenge it. You are restocking the baking aisle at 3:45 when a woman you do not know comes in and stands in front of the flour section with the particular frozen quality of someone who has been sent to the store with a partially specified mission and is working out the details in real time. You ask if she is finding everything. She says she is looking for the flour that makes the light cakes, the one her neighbour told her about. You wait, because there is always more. She says her neighbour said it was in a green box, or maybe it was a red one, she's not sure, and it has something to do with cake specifically. You immediately know she means Swan's down cake flour, which is in a red and white box and not a green one. But you do not say this in a way that corrects her, because the goal is not to be correct. The goal is to solve the problem. You take her to the cake flour section and show her the Swan's down, which is a finely milled soft wheat flour developed specifically for the fine crumb texture of layer cakes, and that has been in American kitchens since the 1880s. You tell her it is what most of the local women use for their white cakes and their pound cakes. She picks up the box and looks at it and says, yes, that is the one, the red one, and you agree that it is the red one, and the transaction is complete. This is the grocery floor in 1956. Not a place of dramatic events or philosophical confrontations, but a place of thousands of small navigations. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. The continuous human work of connecting what people need to the products that will serve that need, in a language that meets each person where they are rather than where the company brochure says they should be. The flour is in a red box. The evaporated milk is in the third section. The Crisco is on the second shelf, and the woman in the blue house dress with the red apron knows where all of it is, and why it matters, and how to say so without making anyone feel they should have known already. Your knowledge of this store extends into the social geography of the neighbourhood, in ways that would not be obvious to anyone who had not been working the same floor for 4 years. You know which families buy the store brand, and which families buy only the name brand, and you know this is not simply a matter of income, because there are families you can see stretching the budget who still buy only the Heinz ketchup and consider the store brand an indignity. And there are families with visible resources who buy the store brand systematically out of a kind of principled practicality that you privately respect. You know which households are new to the neighbourhood and which have been here for 3 generations. You know who is having company this weekend based on what they are buying on Wednesday. And you know which women are in the middle of teaching their daughters to cook based on the careful doubled quantities and the slightly tentative quality of the conversation at the register when they are not quite sure they have everything and they ask your opinion. You do not offer your opinion unless you are asked, because you have learned that the offering of unrequested advice, however well-intentioned, is one of the fastest ways to make a customer feel patronised rather than served. And the feeling of being patronised does not bring anyone back to a store, but when you are asked, you answer with specificity and without condescension, because the question is real and the answer should be real. When Mrs. Kaminsky asks whether the cream of tartar is strictly necessary in the snickerdoodle recipe she's making for the first time, you tell her it is what gives the cookie its characteristic tangy flavour and its slightly chewy interior, and that without it the cookie will be fine but will be a different cookie, and she can decide which cookie she wants to make. This is an accurate answer, and it is also a respectful one, and Mrs. Kaminsky leaves with the cream of tartar, which is the right decision. The cream of tartar question comes up more often than you might expect, because cream of tartar is one of those pantry staples that people buy once for a specific recipe, use a portion of, and then let sit on the back of the spice shelf for the better part of a decade without being entirely sure what else it is for. It is a tartaric acid salt, a byproduct of the winemaking process, and it has been used in baking since before anyone who works in this store was born. It stabilizes beaten egg whites, which means your angel food cake and your meringue will hold their structure longer and stand higher if you use it. It prevents sugar crystals from forming in candy, and in combination with baking soda, it acts as a leavening agent with a specific flavour that baking powder does not quite replicate. The snickerdoodle is the most common recipe that calls for it in combination with baking soda, but it also appears in the 7-minute frosting, in the royal icing for decorated cookies, and in a variety of candy recipes that the cooking magazines periodically revive, and that result in a small spike in cream of tartar sales every time they do. You know this because you have been watching what people buy for 4 years and cross-referencing it with what they ask you about, and the pattern is clear enough to be useful. A spike in cream of tartar sales usually follows a candy feature in a women's magazine by about 2 weeks, which is how long it takes for the magazine to circulate and be read, and for the recipe to move from the printed page to the kitchen counter. Similarly, a spike in cornstarch sales sometimes follows a feature on Chinese American cooking, which has been appearing in the mainstream women's magazines with increasing frequency, as restaurants serving Cantonese-style dishes have become more common in American cities, and the curiosity about reproducing those flavors at home has begun to generate recipe features. The cornstarch goes into the sauce, thickening it in the way that flour cannot quite manage, producing the transparent glossy quality that makes the stir-fried dish look and taste like it came from a restaurant rather than a home kitchen. You find these patterns genuinely interesting, which is something you would not say out loud on the floor, because the floor is not the place for your opinions about the sociology of grocery purchasing, but which you think about on the bus home and at the dinner table when your husband asks how your day was, and you try to condense 8 hours of continuous human observation into something that will not put him to sleep before dessert. He is a good man who works in an office, doing work that he finds meaningful and that you find hard to understand in its details, and you're a good woman who works in a grocery store doing work that he understands well enough to ask after it genuinely, which is a reasonable level of mutual comprehension for a marriage. The afternoon rush on this particular Tuesday includes a run on canned tomatoes, which you notice because 3 different women in the same half-hour period ask whether you have any whole peeled tomatoes in the back, and you do, and you bring a case out from the stockroom and restock the shelf yourself because the stock boy is not there, and the shelf needs to be full before 5 o'clock. The 3 women who asked did not know each other and were not coordinating, but they were all responding to the same thing, which you figure out when you hear one of them mention the tomato soup recipe in this month's McCall's, which apparently calls for whole canned tomatoes in addition to the fresh variety, and which has evidently been widely read this week. This is the grocery store version of a trending topic, spread not through any technology, but through the women's magazine network that connects a kitchen in Ohio to a kitchen in Pennsylvania to a kitchen in Minnesota, through the shared print of a recipe page and the shared experience of going to the store to buy what the recipe calls for. The magazines shape your floor in ways that you track not as an exercise in academic observation, but as a practical management tool, because if you know what is being featured in this month's Good Housekeeping and Ladies' Home Journal and McCall's, you have a reasonable ability to predict what is going to be requested this week, and you can make sure the shelf is stocked accordingly. You do not subscribe to all of them yourself, but Mrs. Kowalski, who occasionally comes in on Thursdays, has a good sense of the recipe trends and will occasionally mention something in passing that turns out to be useful intelligence, and you have cultivated a habit of reading the magazine rack near the door when it's quiet, not from cover to cover but the recipe pages, with the specific attention of someone who is translating printed content into shelf requirements. The register work is its own skill and its own relationship with time. You can ring a full week's groceries in about 4 minutes when the customer has organised their items on the belt with some attention to category, and in about 7 minutes when they have put everything in random order with the dry goods under the cold items and the bread at the bottom, which happens more often than you would expect from adults. You have never said anything about this. You simply ring what is there in the order it appears, and you keep your pace steady, and you add the figures without using the mechanical adding machine because you are faster in your head, and because you do not trust the machine, which sticks occasionally on a long run of additions. Your arithmetic is accurate enough that in 4 years you have not had a meaningful register discrepancy, which Mr. Kowalski noted once in your annual review, in a way that suggested he had been waiting for the appropriate moment to mention it and had decided that the annual review was the appropriate moment. You thanked him and moved on, because accuracy in arithmetic is not an exceptional achievement in your estimation. It is the floor below which you would not allow yourself to fall. The young woman who comes in at 4:30 looking for something called capers is someone you have not seen before, probably new to the neighbourhood, and she is holding a recipe cut from a magazine, and she is looking at it with the expression of someone who has just realised that the ingredient list contains something unfamiliar. Capers are in the condiment section, small jar, green label, near the olives and the cocktail sauce, and you take her there because she will not find them on her own given that she does not know what they look like, and the section is not organised with the unfamiliar in mind. On the way, she asks you what capers are, which is a genuine question that deserves a genuine answer. You tell her they are the pickled flower buds of a Mediterranean shrub, used in European cooking and increasingly in American recipes, with a briny, sharp flavour that works well in sauces with fish or in pasta dishes, or scattered over a smoked salmon platter, and she looks at the jar and says they look like small green peas, and you agree that they do, somewhat. And she buys them with the slightly provisional air of someone committing to an experience they are not entirely sure about. This is how the American pantry expands, one small, unfamiliar jar at a time, bought because a recipe asked for it, tried with cautious hopefulness, and either added to the regular rotation or left to sit on the back of the shelf until it is quietly discarded. You wonder, walking back to the register, whether the capers will become part of her regular pantry, or whether they will sit in the icebox door for 6 months getting used in progressively smaller amounts in things that the recipe did not specifically call for them in, and you decide it is about even odds either way, and that either outcome is fine because the kitchen is large enough for both the experimental and the established, and the woman who tries 1 jar of capers has not surrendered anything by doing so, even if the capers ultimately do not become permanent residents. You think this is the healthy relationship between the pantry and the world beyond it, permeable, curious, selective, and ultimately self-directed. Your afternoon continues. The 5 o'clock rush arrives with the punctuality of a streetcar, and you work the register and walk the floor and answer the questions and face out the shelves during the brief lulls between customers, and at 6:30 the last customer leaves and the door is locked and you begin the closing tasks that are your half of the closing team, the floor sweep and the register count, and the final check of the cold cases to make sure the temperatures are holding. The walk-in cooler at the back of the store smells of produce and cold air and the particular clean industrial smell of refrigeration that you no longer notice because you have walked into it too many times to register it as separate from the rest of the store's sensory landscape. Mr. Kowalski comes out of his office at 6:45 and asks how the day went, which is his daily question, and you give him the daily answer, which is your honest assessment of traffic, stock levels, and anything he needs to know about, organised in the 2-minute version because he will have his own accounting of it from the register, and does not need a longer version from you. You mention the cream of wheat is running low, and the Crisco needs restocking before Saturday, and that you had 2 questions today about the new Lipton onion soup mix that people are apparently using as something other than soup. He nods and makes his own note. You change out of the uniform in the back room, put your regular coat over your dress, tie your scarf, and walk out the back door into the October evening. The street is quieter now, the errands done, the stores closing, the particular tired emptiness of a commercial block at the end of a working day. You walk to the bus stop and you stand there waiting, and your feet, in their low-heeled practical shoes, are doing what feet do after 8 hours on a linoleum floor, which is to say they are making their displeasure quietly known, and you shift your weight and think about dinner and whether there is enough of the leftover chicken to make something from without going back to any kind of grocery store, and you decide there is. And this too is a small competence, the calibration of reserves, the domestic arithmetic of what is on hand and what it can become. The bus comes, you get on, and somewhere across the city, in a dozen different kitchens, the women who came into Kowalski's today are opening their pantry doors and reaching for what they bought, and the shelves they are reaching toward were made possible, at least in part, by the knowledge and patience and unhurried attentiveness of someone in a blue dress and a red apron, who spent her day making sure everything was where it was supposed to be. Now for the gap, because there is always a gap, and the gap between the official image of the post-war American pantry and the actual pantry of the actual American household is wider and stranger and more interesting than most of the magazine photographs were designed to reveal. Look at any women's magazine from the late 1940s or the 1950s and you will find, in the pages between the dress patterns and the beauty columns and the advice about getting your husband to communicate more effectively, a vision of the American pantry so gleaming and ordered and comprehensively stocked that it functions less as a realistic representation of a storage space and more as a theological statement about the proper relationship between the American housewife and the American consumer economy. The shelves in these photographs are wide and evenly lit and hold their contents at precisely the correct angles. The labels all face forward, which no actual pantry in the history of human habitation has ever consistently maintained. The products are arranged by category with the kind of rigorous logic that suggests they were placed by someone who will never cook from them. There are no half-empty cans wrapped in aluminum foil. There are no baking supplies that have been left open too long and are slightly compacted at the top. There are no items that have been pushed to the back and forgotten, and that have developed opinions about their continued existence. The pantry in the magazine is not a pantry. It is an argument. The argument is that the properly run American household operates according to a logic of abundance and order that is simultaneously domestic and industrial, that the woman who runs it is part of a system of consumption that is rational and modern, and that reflects her good values and her correct priorities, that the products on her shelves are not just useful objects, but evidence of her participation in the post-war economy in the right way, as an efficient and informed consumer whose choices reflect the best of what American industry has to offer. The gleaming pantry is the domestic equivalent of the factory floor, a place where things are organized and processed and productive, and its condition is a measure of its manager's competence in ways that extend well beyond the practical matter of whether there is enough flour to make a cake. This argument was being made simultaneously by the women's magazines, the food companies advertising in those magazines, the home economics movement that had been building its institutional infrastructure since the 1880s, and the major appliance manufacturers who were selling refrigerators and freezers and the newest food preservation technology with the same language of rational modernity. All of these forces agreed that the kitchen, and by extension the pantry, was a site of scientific management rather than improvised tradition, and that the woman who ran it should understand her role not as a continuation of her mother's and grandmother's domestic practices, but as a modern upgrade of those practices informed by the latest research in nutrition and food technology and domestic efficiency. The actual pantry disagreed. Not loudly, not publicly, but in the accumulated evidence of what was actually in it. Because the actual American pantry of the 1950s was the product of 3 overlapping sets of pressures that the magazine photographs were not designed to capture. It was the product of the Depression-era habits that the mothers and grandmothers of those housewives had formed during a decade of genuine scarcity, habits of conservation and improvisation, and the reuse of everything that had calcified into permanent practice, even now that the economy had recovered and the A&P had everything in abundance. It was the product of the wartime rationing that had ended less than a decade before, which had required American home cooks to work around the absence of sugar, butter, canned goods, and meat in ways that required genuine ingenuity, and that had produced a generation of women who knew how to substitute and improvise and extend a recipe in ways that the recipe did not officially countenance. And it was the product of the real budgetary constraints of the real households, in which real women were doing the real work of feeding real families on real incomes that did not always match the idealized consumer in the magazine's imagination. The Depression-era habits showed up in specific and persistent ways. The coffee can on the counter that held the bacon fat, collected from every morning's frying and saved for future use in absolutely anything that could benefit from rendered pork fat, which turned out to be a considerable number of things. The large glass jar in the icebox that held the vegetable cooking water, the water from boiled potatoes and carrots and green beans, save for adding to soups and gravies because it held flavour and nutrients that the magazines were beginning to call vitamins, and that older women had known about for generations without needing a specific word for them. The bread that was never thrown out until it was genuinely beyond use, which meant that stale bread was the beginning of bread pudding or croutons or a thickener for soups rather than a disposal problem, and that the bread box was not simply a holding place for fresh bread but a site of active pantry management. These habits were not the habits that the food companies wanted to encourage, because food companies profit from consumption rather than conservation, and a woman who makes breadcrumbs from her stale bread is a woman who is not buying Progresso Italian breadcrumbs at Kowalski's, and a woman who saves her bacon fat is a woman who is not buying as much Crisco. The magazines understood this dynamic and navigated it carefully, occasionally publishing articles about economy and thrift that were immediately adjacent to advertisements for the very products that thrift made unnecessary, because the magazines were simultaneously serving their readers and their advertisers, and those two relationships did not always want the same things. The wartime improvisations showed up as a kind of creative flexibility around substitution that the official post-war domestic ideal did not exactly celebrate, but that women continued to practice because it worked, and because the recipes they had developed during rationing were, in many cases, genuinely good. The eggless cakes that used applesauce or mashed banana where eggs would normally go, and that turned out to be moist and flavourful in ways the egg-based original was not always. The butter-free cookies made with vegetable oil that had a texture their own, neither better nor worse than the original but different and worth making. The stretches and extensions, the meatloaf that incorporated oatmeal or crackers or rice to make the pound of ground beef feed 6 instead of 4, the soup that started with a bone and some water and 2 onions and became, through a patient afternoon on the back of the stove, something that tasted of real effort and genuine flavour regardless of what it cost to make. These were not the meals the magazines were photographing. The magazines were photographing the mold-released Jell-O salad with the maraschino cherries arranged in a pattern, and the 3-tiered birthday cake with the professional-looking frosting swirls, and the pot roast surrounded by the perfectly uniform glazed carrots. And those things existed and were real, and were made with genuine skill and care. But they were not Tuesday. They were the Saturday or Sunday version of domestic cooking. The company version. The photograph version. The version that was offered to the world as evidence of competence and plenty. Tuesday was the leftover pot roast made into something new, and the soup made from the bones and the bread made from the flour in the canister that had been refilled from the large sack bought at a discount at the beginning of the month. The gap between the gleaming pantry and the working pantry was also a gap between the products that companies wanted women to buy and the products that women actually found indispensable. The companies wanted to sell the new, the branded, the processed, the modern, the pre-measured and pre-seasoned and pre-assembled convenience that would save time and produce reliable results, and above all require regular repurchase. These products were real, and they were useful, and the women who bought them were not wrong to buy them. The Jell-O was genuinely convenient. The Campbell soup was genuinely time-saving. The Crisco was genuinely consistent. These things earned their place on the pantry shelf on their merits. But alongside them, stubbornly, were the older things, the things whose place in the pantry predated the consumer economy by generations. The dried beans, pinto and navy and black-eyed peas, sitting in their jars because beans were protein at the lowest possible cost and because a pot of beans simmered with a ham, hock was a meal that no convenience food had quite managed to replicate in terms of the satisfaction it produced and the scale at which it could be made. The cornmeal, yellow and coarse, for the cornbread that accompanied those beans and for the griddle cakes on Sunday morning, and occasionally for the spoon bread that was the kind of thing you made when you wanted to remind yourself that cooking was sometimes an act of pleasure and not just an act of provision. The dried herbs that came from the backyard garden, the sage and the thyme and the parsley that had been hung to dry in the basement and stored in glass jars with handwritten labels, sitting beside the commercial spice jars on the pantry shelf without any sense of incongruity, because the pantry contained whatever worked, and the question of whether it was traditional or modern was entirely secondary to the question of whether it tasted right. The pantry also contained things that no magazine photograph included, because they were not photogenic and not glamorous, and not connected to any brand that bought advertising space. The heel of hard cheese wrapped in wax paper that was too small to slice but too good to throw away, and that would be grated over the casserole or melted into the soup. The half bottle of vinegar that had been decanted from a larger jug into a smaller one for ease of use. The container of leftover rice from last Thursday that was destined for the fried rice on Friday. The slightly overripe bananas on the counter that everyone had been moving past for 2 days and that were going to become banana bread by tomorrow morning because the alternative was waste, and waste was not an option that anyone who grew up during the Depression accepted with equanimity. The technology of the pantry also had its shadow side. The canned goods that the food companies promoted so enthusiastically as modern and time-saving and safe were in fact not without their complications, which were understood at the time but not discussed with the same enthusiasm as the benefits. The standard metal can of the 1950s was coated on the inside with a tin lining that prevented the food from coming into direct contact with the steel, but the lining was not always complete and not always effective, and the instructions on the cans to use a clean can opener and to transfer leftovers to a different container before refrigerating were not arbitrary caution, but reflected a genuine if rarely discussed awareness that an open metal can in the icebox was not an ideal storage container. Women who had been running households for a while knew this without knowing exactly why they knew it. The way they knew that you did not leave cut potatoes sitting in water overnight or use an aluminum pot for tomato sauce. Accumulated practical wisdom that had not been formally codified, but that worked. The freezer, which was beginning to enter American households in more significant numbers by the early 1950s, as combination refrigerator-freezer units replaced the older single-temperature iceboxes, introduced its own complications. The food companies were enormously enthusiastic about frozen food, which represented both a new product category and a way to extend the shelf life and geographical reach of perishable goods, and they promoted frozen vegetables and frozen dinners and frozen orange juice, concentrate with the same language of modernity and convenience that they had used for canned goods a generation earlier. The magazines followed along, running articles about how to stock and manage a home freezer that were essentially extended advertisements for the frozen food industry, dressed as domestic advice. But the actual experience of early home freezers was more complicated than the promotion suggested. Freezer burn was a real problem in units that did not maintain perfectly consistent temperatures, and early home freezers were not always perfectly consistent. The quality of frozen vegetables varied considerably by product and by manufacturer, and by how the vegetables had been handled between the field and the freezer case, and women who were used to the taste of fresh garden produce or home canned goods were not always persuaded that the frozen version was the equivalent the companies claimed. The logistics of frozen food management, the rotation of stock, the thawing protocols, the question of what could be refrozen after partial thawing and what could not, were genuinely complex and were not always addressed with adequate specificity in the recipes and instructions that came with the products. The Gap. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. The gap between the modern pantry of the magazine and the real pantry of the household was, at its deepest level, the gap between a consumption economy's need for its participants to continually buy new things and the practical intelligence of women who had learned, through scarcity and necessity and plain experience, how to make what they had go further, last longer, and taste better than the labelled container, or the measured recipe, or the brand name product alone could accomplish. These were not incompatible things. The same woman could buy the Jell-O and also know 17 ways to use a chicken carcass. She could keep the Crisco on the second shelf and also keep the bacon fat can on the counter. She could use the Campbell's soup as a base for her cream sauce, and also know how to make a cream sauce from scratch when she had the time and wanted to. The real pantry was both of these things simultaneously, the modern and the traditional, the branded and the improvised, the purchased convenience and the accumulated wisdom, not because women were confused about which one was correct, but because both of them were correct, and the intelligence of the real pantry was in knowing when to reach for which one. That was the knowledge the magazine photographs did not show, not because it was a secret exactly, but because a photograph of a woman tapping the bottom of a freshly baked bread loaf to check for doneness or tasting a soup stock and adding a pinch of this and more of that and a splash of vinegar to lift, it was not a photograph that sold canned soup or commercially produced bread or branded spice mixes. The real pantry was not a product of advertising, it was a product of people, of the particular woman in the particular house with the particular history, and the particular family and the particular week's worth of challenges and resources and plans, all of which were being managed with a combination of what the companies sold her and what her grandmother taught her and what she had figured out herself through the accumulated trial and error of years of feeding people who depended on her to get it right. That is what lived on those shelves, not a collection of brands, a collection of decisions. And the 26 forgotten staples, or the 25 or the 30, depending on which magazine article you read or which era you are thinking of, were not forgotten in any real sense by the women who used them. They were simply not the things that the advertisements spent money promoting, because the advertisements promoted what was new and what generated the most profit and the most useful things in any pantry. The things with the widest range of applications and the most consistent daily presence were often the oldest and least glamorous and least interesting to the marketing departments. The cream of tartar and the cornmeal, and the baker's chocolate and the dried mushrooms and the whole peppercorns and the sweet pickle relish and the anchovy paste that nobody admitted to keeping, but that found its way into certain gravies and salad dressings in small and transformative quantities. These things were in the pantry because they worked, and they worked because they had been working for a long time, and they needed no promotion beyond the food itself. What we forget when we look at the mid-century pantry from a distance is that the women who maintained it were not passive recipients of a consumer culture's instructions. They were active agents of a domestic economy, making daily decisions about what to buy and what to make, what to keep and what to let go, what was worth the extra cost and what was just as good from the store brand, what the magazine said and what their own experience had taught them, and how to navigate the gap between those two sources of authority with the pragmatic intelligence of someone who has to feed people tonight and does not have time for ideology. The pantry was their tool. They knew it better than anyone, and if the magazines never quite captured it correctly, that was the magazine's limitation, not the pantry's. There is also the question of what the pantry was supposed to represent socially, beyond its functional contents, and this too is a gap between the official image and the lived reality that the magazine photographs worked very hard to maintain rather than reveal. The well-stocked pantry was not just a supply depot, it was evidence. Evidence of a household well managed, of a woman who planned ahead and shopped carefully, and kept her supplies organised and her family fed with variety and competence. In a social world where the domestic sphere was the primary arena in which women's status was evaluated, the pantry was a form of currency, and keeping it in the right condition was a matter that carried genuine social weight. This meant that the pantry was sometimes curated for visitors in a way that had more to do with presentation than with practice. Women knew that certain guests would notice certain things, and that certain things would be noticed in certain ways, and the pantry that the mother-in-law might glance into during a visit was not always identical to the pantry as it existed on an ordinary Tuesday when no one was coming. The chaotic reality of the working shelf, with its half-opened packages and its products turned at odd angles and its expiration dates that had been optimistically extended by someone who had not actually eaten the contents, was replaced for company by the facing and straightening and organising that produced the version of the pantry that looked like what a good housekeeper's pantry was supposed to look like. This is not dishonesty in any meaningful sense, because the underlying competence was real and the organisation was real when applied, and because every social setting involves a certain amount of presentation that does not fully represent the unmanaged state of things. But it does illuminate the social layer of pantry management that sits beneath the purely practical layer, and that helps explain the persistence of the magazine pantry ideal long after it was clear that no real pantry looked quite like that. Because the ideal was not describing a reality that existed, it was describing a standard that women were expected to be able to approximate when it mattered, and the gap between the everyday reality and the approximated ideal was understood and accepted as part of the domestic contract. The economics of the post-war American pantry also contained a gap that the gleaming magazine images worked deliberately to obscure. The magazines were primarily read by middle-class women in households with middle-class incomes, and the brands they advertised were priced for middle-class budgets, and the recipes they published were designed with middle-class kitchen equipment and middle-class time in mind. But the women reading those magazines included many who were managing on budgets that did not always correspond to the assumption behind the advertisements, and the gap between the aspirational pantry of the magazine and the available pantry of the household was sometimes simply a matter of money. The store brands existed precisely to serve this gap, offering the functional equivalent of the name brand at a price that fit within a tighter budget, and the women who used them were not making a lesser choice in terms of domestic competence, but a smarter one in terms of household economics. The margarine versus butter calculation, which occupied the mid-century food world considerably more than it occupies us now because the argument was still live and the technology was still improving, was partly about flavour and partly about economics, and the households that used margarine in 1956 were not failing to maintain the standard of the gleaming kitchen. They were maintaining a different standard, one that acknowledged the real budget and made the best decision within it. Oleomargarine, as it was still sometimes called by women who had learned the word in an earlier era, had been through a long and acrimonious fight with the dairy industry before it reached the mid-century American table in anything approaching its modern form. The dairy lobby had been working since the 1800s to restrict the sale and use of margarine through legislation and taxation, and in many states the product was legally required to be sold uncoloured, a pale white that nobody wanted to spread on their toast, with a separate packet of orange colouring that the consumer mixed in themselves if they wanted it to look like butter. The mixing of the colour was a kitchen ritual that became sufficiently familiar to have its own domestic technology. Small plastic bags with a colour capsule inside that you worked with your hands until the orange spread evenly through the white fat, producing something that looked like butter whether or not it tasted exactly like it. The federal margarine tax was finally repealed in 1950, and the state laws against coloured margarine fell away gradually through the early 50s, and by the mid-decade the product was more accessible and more acceptable than it had been for most of its existence. But the dairy industry's long campaign had left its mark on how margarine was perceived, and the ambivalence that many women felt about using it, the sense that it was a compromise rather than a choice, was partly the residue of decades of anti-margarine propaganda that had been very effective at attaching a certain social stigma to the product that its actual performance did not justify. The question of what was in the fat and what the fat was doing to people's health was also beginning to move into public consciousness by the mid-50s, though it had not yet reached the crisis point that it would arrive at in the following decades. Anil Keys, the University of Minnesota physiologist who had studied the relationship between dietary fat and heart disease, was publishing his findings and giving his lectures, and the hypothesis that saturated fat in the diet was connected to elevated cholesterol and elevated risk of cardiovascular disease was beginning to circulate in scientific and eventually popular media. But the full public reckoning with that hypothesis was still years away, and in the 1956 kitchen, the fat questions were practical rather than medical. Crisco or butter, margarine or lard, fry or bake. How much and how often, and will it taste the way it is supposed to taste? The pharmaceutical companies had not yet created the vocabulary of cholesterol management that would eventually become part of the everyday domestic conversation about food, and the women shopping at Kowalski's in 1956 were not reading ingredient labels with an eye towards saturated fat content or trans fat percentages. They were reading them, if they read them at all, for information about how to use the product and whether it would do what they needed it to do. The health implications of those choices were not part of the domestic calculus in the same explicit way, which is not a failure of intelligence but simply the condition of being a person in a specific historical moment with access only to the information that that moment has made available. The vitamin and mineral fortification of processed foods, which had begun in earnest during the 1940s and that by the 50s had produced a food supply in which Wonder Bread was fortified with B vitamins and carnation milk with vitamin D and various breakfast cereals with an expanding roster of nutrients, created its own layer of complexity in the pantry's relationship to health. The fortification was real and had real nutritional effects, and the addition of iodine to table salt, which had essentially eliminated iodine deficiency and goiter from the American population, was a genuine public health success story. But the marketing of fortification, which presented processed and refined foods as superior to their whole food counterparts by virtue of the vitamins added back after processing had removed them, was a circular argument whose circularity the advertising did not dwell on. The woman at the Kowalski's register was not making these calculations explicitly as she chose between the enriched white flour and the whole wheat flour, or between the fortified breakfast cereal and the plain oatmeal. She was making the choices that her family's preferences, her budget, and the practical demands of her cooking life suggested, and the nutritional framework she brought to those choices was the nutritional framework that the era had provided, which was partial and in some respects actively misleading, and in other respects genuinely useful. This is the condition of all consumers in all eras, choosing from among the available options with the available information, neither fully rational nor fully deceived, navigating the space between what they know and what they do not yet know with the pragmatic intelligence of daily life. There is one more layer to this story that the institutional analysis tends to leave out, because it concerns not the policies or the products or the advertising campaigns, but the objects themselves, the specific tins and jars and boxes and cans that inhabited the actual shelf, and what those objects meant to the women who kept them. Because the pantry staple, the item that is always there and always replenished, eventually stops being just a product and becomes something more like furniture. It takes on the quality of permanence, of reliable presence, in a way that a new or occasional purchase never quite manages. The Rumford baking powder in its distinctive red and yellow can, the Caro syrup in its wide-mouthed bottle with the blue cap, the Baker's German sweet chocolate in its paper-wrapped form that you had to break rather than slice, the Domino sugar in its yellow bag that you refilled into the canister rather than keeping the bag on the shelf because the bag was not the same as the canister, and the canister was where the sugar lived. These things accumulated a kind of domestic permanence through repetition that bound them to the routines and sensory memories of the household in ways that transcended their commercial origins. Ask any woman who grew up in a mid-century American household what she remembers of her mother's kitchen, and somewhere in the answer will be a specific can or jar or container that she has not thought about in decades, and that will return with sudden and unexpected vividness. The specific colour of the Watkins vanilla extract bottle, the weight of the ball canning jar lid when you tested the seal, the way the Calumet can sounded when you opened it, the particular smell of the Folgers coffee can when you lifted the lid. These are not nostalgic confections. They are accurate sensory memories, preserved in the nervous system with the efficiency that the brain applies to things encountered regularly and reliably, things that came to stand for the constancy of a particular kitchen and the particular life lived in it. This is what the forgotten pantry staples actually were, not a curiosity list of products that no longer exist and that people might vaguely recognise from their grandmother's house, not a historical inventory of pre-modern cooking supplies, but the material record of the small and daily choices that constituted the domestic intelligence of a generation, the evidence of what was valued and what was relied upon and what kept things running, accumulated shelf by shelf over the decades in which the American pantry moved from the rural root cellar and the springhouse and the smokehouse through the icebox and the Frigidaire and the deep freeze, and toward whatever the next version of all of it would turn out to be. The women who maintained those pantries were doing something that deserves more than the word domestic. They were running the logistics of daily human life, the provisioning and planning and preparation that made it possible for children to grow, and husbands to go to work, and holidays to occur, and guests to be fed, and illnesses to be managed, and ordinary Tuesdays to pass without crisis. They were doing it with whatever the market offered, and whatever their grandmothers knew, and whatever their own experience had taught them, and they were doing it within budgets and kitchens and social expectations that were not always designed with their convenience in mind, and they were doing it largely without recognition, because the work was invisible in the specific way that all essential infrastructure is invisible. You only notice it when it fails. The pantry did not often fail. The bread was made, the soup was ready, the casserole was assembled and in the oven before anyone arrived home asking what was for dinner. The shelves were stocked and organised and accounted for, the list made, the shopping done, the rotation maintained, the recipes produced on schedule, the variations managed, the improvisations accomplished with the calm authority of someone who knows their material. This is what was on the shelf, this is what it was for, and this is who kept it there. The staples that deserve the deepest attention in the 1950s pantry are the ones whose names have become unfamiliar, not because they stopped being useful, but because the products themselves were reformulated or rebranded, or absorbed into other products, or simply replaced by a convenience alternative that did the same job in less time with less skill required. Baker's German sweet chocolate is one of these, a dark baking chocolate with a specific sugar level, developed by a man named Samuel German who worked for the Baker's Chocolate Company in the 1850s, whose recipe for a chocolate layer cake was published in a Dallas newspaper in 1957 and spread so rapidly through the women's magazine network that the Baker's Company could barely keep up with production. The German chocolate cake, whose name people assumed referred to the country rather than the man, became one of the signature American cakes of the mid-century, and the specific sweetness of Samuel German's chocolate became a pantry staple that you could not substitute for without changing the cake in ways that the people who had eaten it before would immediately notice. The Brer Rabbit molasses tin, with its illustration of a rabbit that managed to be simultaneously cheerful and slightly unsettling, held the thick dark sweetness that went into the baked beans and the gingerbread and the occasional batch of cookies that your mother made when she wanted something that felt like winter, the particular warm dark flavour that white sugar and even brown sugar could not replicate. Because molasses is not just sweetness, it is minerals and complexity and the specific flavour of sugarcane at its most concentrated, and it has been in American kitchens in continuous use since before the Revolution. The tin sat on the shelf with a permanence that predated everything around it and needed no advertising to maintain its position, because the thing it did for the baked beans could not be done by anything else. The Old Bay seasoning in its familiar yellow and white tin with the ship on the label was not yet the universal American condiment it would eventually become, but in households with any connection to the Chesapeake region or the broader mid-Atlantic shore tradition of blue crab and steamed shrimp, it was already as essential as the salt beside it. The blend of celery salt and black pepper and cayenne, and smoked paprika and bay and other spices was formulated by a German immigrant named Gustav Brunn in Baltimore in the late 1930s, and it entered the American pantry through the seafood tradition of the region, before spreading with the post-war mobility of a population that moved for work and for housing, and that carried its culinary habits with it when it went. These are the forgotten pantry staples in their truest sense, not things that have genuinely disappeared, but things that have been present so continuously and so unremarkably that the knowledge of where they came from and why they were chosen has thinned out, leaving only the habit. The woman buying the baker's German sweet chocolate in 1956 did not think about Samuel German or his employer, or the development of a sweetened baking chocolate product in the 1850s. She thought about the cake she was making and the fact that this was what the recipe called for and that it worked. This is the appropriate relationship between a pantry staple and its user. The history is interesting, but it is not required for the result. The result is required. The history is a gift. The Watkins and Rawley men deserve a brief mention, because they were part of the way the mid-century pantry was actually stocked for households in smaller towns and rural areas, households that were not always within easy reach of a Kowalski's or an A&P or any other well-supplied grocery store. The Watkins man and the Rawley man were direct-to-door salesmen who carried a case of extracts and spices and medicinal products and household supplies, and who made their rounds on a schedule that was as predictable as the milkman's, and that was in some areas the primary way that a household obtained the vanilla extract and the black pepper and the liniment and the salve that it needed. The relationship between these salesmen and the households they served was a genuine domestic relationship, built over years of regular contact, and the products they sold occupied the same pantry shelf as the store-bought brands without any sense of inferior status because they were often quite good, and because the alternative was a significant trip to the nearest town of any size. The direct sales model for domestic products has a long American history that the post-war suburban grocery store largely displaced, but which never entirely disappeared, and which in the 1950s was still a meaningful part of the supply chain for a significant portion of the American population. The Avon lady, in her own category, was the beauty counter equivalent of the Watkins man, bringing the products of personal care directly to the household in a model that acknowledged the reality of women's limited mobility and the genuine social and commercial opportunity in the door-to-door relationship. These direct relationships with suppliers gave the pantry a dimension that the grocery store did not quite replicate. A personal one, in which the person selling the extract had a name and a face, and would be back next month to see whether the allspice had been useful, and whether anything else was running low. The pantry also had its seasonal dimension that the year-round grocery store availability of canned and dried goods tended to flatten, but that persisted in the actual practice of the households that maintained it. The November arrival of the good dried cranberries at the market brought in for Thanksgiving was still an event worth noting even when cranberry sauce from the Ocean Spray can had been available all year for a decade. The spring appearance of the first asparagus at the produce stand and the late summer availability of the good sweet corn still organised the cooking calendar in ways that the frozen section and the canned goods section did not fully replace, because the fresh seasonal item was genuinely different from the preserved version, and the women who cooked knew this even when the marketing of processed food was doing its level best to suggest otherwise. Tonight, we travelled through a few specific hours of a very specific world. We spent a Tuesday morning inside a kitchen that no longer exists exactly as it was, moving through a pantry stocked with the particular intelligence of a woman who knew every item on every shelf and why it was there. We followed the story of one blue and white tin that helped change the way a nation cooked, from the chemical patents of the early 1900s through the kitchen counters of the post-war suburbs and eventually to a reformulation that closed a chapter that most people had not quite realised was still open. We stood on the other side of the grocery counter for an afternoon, in a blue house dress with a red apron, in the 4,000 square foot working world of a neighbourhood grocery store where the knowledge of where things were was itself a form of expertise worth having. And then we looked at the gap, the wide and honest and genuinely interesting gap between the magazine's vision of the gleaming pantry and the actual pantry of the actual household, with its half-empty cans wrapped in foil and its saved bacon fat and its jar of cornmeal that predated every brand in the store by generations. What connects these four stories is something quiet and recurring, the way that the most important work tends to be organised around things that look ordinary from the outside. A tin of shortening, a can of tomato soup, a box of cornstarch, a row of spice jars in approximate but functional order. None of these things are dramatic. None of them were designed to be remembered. They were designed to be used and used again, and refilled when empty, and used again after that, in the daily practice of keeping people fed and a household running, and the week organised enough that Thursday's potluck would arrive on time, and the casserole would come out right, and the bread would cool on the rack before anyone got home asking what was for dinner. What I find genuinely moving about this world, and I mean this in the most specific and unsentimental possible sense, is the competence of it. The accumulated practical intelligence that lived in those kitchens and those pantries, and those women who ran them with a matter-of-factness that did not require recognition, because recognition was not the point. The point was that the bread was made. The point was that the shelves were stocked. The point was that Tuesday happened the way it was supposed to happen, and Wednesday would also happen, and the week would be provisioned and organised, and the family would not go without, and none of that was glamorous, but all of it was real. There is a certain kind of knowledge that does not survive the end of its era very cleanly. The knowledge of how to do things that people have stopped needing to do the same way, the knowledge that lived in the hands and the body, and the daily routine rather than in books or records. The woman who could feel when the bread dough was right, who could judge the temperature of the skillet by how the Crisco looked in it, who knew the weight of a properly stocked pantry versus one that was running thin, she carried that knowledge in a form that could be transmitted through demonstration, but that did not translate easily into a list or an article or a photograph. And when her particular form of daily practice ended, which it did as the decades turned and the food culture shifted and the kitchen began to look different in fundamental ways, that knowledge did not simply move to another container. It thinned out. It became partial. It became historical. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. This is not a loss that needs mourning exactly. The kitchens of today have their own intelligence, their own accumulating practical wisdom, their own specific objects that will one day be as evocative to someone's memory as the Calumet baking powder can is to the grandchildren of the women who bought it. Every era produces its own version of this, the quiet material culture of daily life, the things that are always there until they are not. But there is something worth sitting with before you drift off tonight, in the image of the Tuesday morning kitchen in the mid-century house, the one that smells of coffee and bread, and the faint warm metal smell of the iron that has been on since just after 8, with the percolator cooling on the second burner and the bread on the rack and the list on the counter and the pantry door standing slightly open the way it does when the latch does not quite catch. The woman who made all of that happen has been on her feet since before 6:30. She has managed more simultaneous threads of planning and execution than most official kinds of work require, and she has done it without drama and without particular recognition, and with the competence of someone who has done it enough times to have stopped needing to think about most of it consciously. She's sitting down now, finally, with her 4th cup of coffee that she has already decided not to count, looking at the backyard through the window and thinking about Wednesday, because Wednesday is already organising itself in the back of her mind without requiring her permission, the gelatin salad and the mother-in-law and the Halloween costumes and the shopping list that is not quite finished yet. She's tired in the specific way of someone who has done a great deal without it looking like a great deal from the outside. The bread is cooling, the pantry is stocked, the week is provisioned, everything on the shelf is where it's supposed to be, and it will all be reached for again tomorrow. Good. Where in the world are you watching from? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. See you on the next one.